In 1885, in the Golden Hills of California, a small village called Mill Creek seemed like an ordinary place, without any major events to highlight. However, amidst the tranquil landscape and the simple life of its inhabitants, there was a boy who made the adults question the limitations of logic and reason. 9-year-old Jameson Taylor was unlike other children his age. While his peers spent their days playing hide-and-seek or running through the hills, Jameson spent hours observing the sky, drawing complex diagrams on crumpled scraps of paper, and asking questions that no one knew how to answer. His parents, Martha and William Taylor, were simple farmers, always busy working the land. They loved their son, but couldn't understand his peculiarities. Jameson was unlike other children. He was introspective, restless, always seeking to understand the world in a unique way. It wasn't that he was a prodigy or had extraordinary abilities, but his reasoning was different. He seemed to understand concepts that only adults could explain, but even so, with a deep and curious understanding. It was a hot summer day when the first incident occurred. Jameson was in the barn, trying to assemble a structure made of straw and wood, an experiment he believed to be the key to making a plant grow faster. William, his father, who was already tired of his pointless inventions, came in and ordered the boy to stop. Jameson, however, was engrossed in his task and did not respond immediately. "Jameson, you're wasting your time with this nonsense. Logic says this won't work. It has to be simpler," shouted William, irritated by his son's behavior. Jameson looked at him with his deep eyes and, in a calm tone, said, "But Dad, logic also says that something simple can't generate extraordinary results. Perhaps the real answer lies precisely in what we cannot see." William, perplexed, didn't know how to react. He had never known how to respond to Jameson, who always seemed to find an unbeatable logic for everything he said. Despite the simplicity of his words, something in the way he spoke made everything seem more complex and possible. That night, while Martha prepared dinner, the boy sat silently gazing at the stars. He was always drawn to them, as if something lay there waiting to be discovered. There was a glimmer in his mind, a spark of something not yet understood. He knew he couldn't be the only one to perceive these small truths invisible to others. The village, like everywhere else, had its conventions. There were unspoken rules, limits established by a logical system that everyone followed. But Jameson wasn't satisfied with the idea that there were definitive answers for everything. He believed that true logic lay not only in what was visible and immediate, but in what was behind what no one dared to question. The next morning, Jameson awoke with a feeling that something was about to happen. He felt he was about to unravel a mystery that everyone considered impossible. During breakfast, he told his mother, with a serious expression, "Today will be the day the answers come. I know it." Martha smiled and stroked his head, but inside she felt a mixture of worry and fear. What was her son trying to achieve? And why did his thoughts always seem so distant from everyday reality? As the sun rose, the city continued its routine, but for Jameson, the search for the unknown was only beginning. He knew that something beyond the reach of conventional logic awaited him, something that, if discovered, would change not only his life, but the understanding of everyone around him. Have you ever come across something you couldn't explain, but a young mind came up with an unexpected solution? As the days went by, Jameson began to stand out, not only for his eccentric ideas, but for the way he observed the world around him. In the village of Mill Creek, a simple place where life went on without major changes, people had well-established routines. But for Jameson, every detail had a hidden meaning. The city itself seemed out of time, as if the clock of life had stopped there, long before the arrival of new agricultural methods or the technologies that were beginning to take over the big cities. The dirt roads, the wooden houses, and the cultivated fields were nothing exceptional, But for Jameson, each of these things was a component of something much bigger. He observed the animals with a peculiar curiosity. While everyone else wandered through the city, he wondered why the horse seemed so calm as it gazed at the river, and how the leaves on the trees, moved by the wind, seemed to move as if they were dancing a choreography. Instead of getting carried away by the banal conversations of the other boys, Jameson dedicated himself to understanding the behavior of things around him, as if each scene had something to teach. The contrast between Jameson and the other townspeople was stark. While he preoccupied himself with philosophical and scientific questions, his parents were focused on ensuring the farm continued to be profitable, paying no attention to what seemed to be their son's daydreams. William, his father, was a man with calloused hands from hard work and a pragmatic mind, who firmly believed that physical effort and practical knowledge were the only things that truly mattered. He couldn't understand his son's anxieties, who spent hours making seemingly meaningless calculations or creating theories about plant growth. Martha, on the other hand, was more understanding, though still worried. She tried to support Jameson, but felt that what he was pursuing could lead him to places she didn't know how to handle. She knew her son wasn't like the others, but she didn't know if that was a good or dangerous thing. The antagonist in this whole story wasn't a single person, but rather the community's own belief system. Mill Creek, though it seemed a peaceful place, was steeped in rigid social norms that didn't accept anything outside the norm. Jameson, with his ideas, represented a break from this structure. His questioning behavior set him apart, and he would soon become the target of criticism from adults who saw him as a challenge to the established order. But Jameson was not alone in his quest. There were other young men, more timid and less daring, who secretly admired him and saw in him a hope to escape the monotony of life in the small town. They watched him from afar, waiting for a sign, perhaps even a word that would encourage them to go beyond the limits of Mill Creek. However, the difficulties weren't just external. Within himself, Jameson faced a constant conflict. He knew that his way of thinking made him different, and that this could alienate him from everyone. But at the same time, he was certain that his destiny was to find something greater than what everyone believed was possible. During the winter of 1885, an unexpected event would transform the boy's life forever. Something would happen that would require Jameson to use all his reasoning skills to solve a mystery that would defy logic and reason in a way he never imagined. Fate was preparing him for something that would change the lives of everyone in Mill Creek. But before that, he needed to discover something about himself that would take him beyond everything he knew. In a place where everyone follows the same rules, have you ever felt different or misunderstood for trying to think differently? Winter arrived early in Mill Creek that year, and with it, a tense atmosphere began to weigh on Jameson. The small town, which had always been quiet and uneventful, began to show cracks in its peaceful facade. Something was about to happen, something that would shatter the monotony of the inhabitants' simple lives. Jameson, with his restless mind, knew something was wrong, but he couldn't quite pinpoint what. The nights were darker than usual, and the wind seemed to whisper secrets he couldn't understand. For weeks, he had noticed a series of inexplicable events happening around the city. Trees had fallen for no apparent reason, animals were acting strangely, even people's behavior seemed more erratic. Something wasn't right, and Jameson was determined to find out what it was. It all began with the disappearance of one of the oldest families in the village, the Masons. On a cold morning, as the town awoke to its daily routine, the Masons' house was empty. There were no signs of a struggle, no logical explanation, just the emptiness of the home, as if the people had simply vanished. What disturbed Jameson most, however, was that no one seemed to question the situation. The adults of Mill Creek, blind to the evidence, tried to go on with their lives as if nothing had happened. This irritated him deeply. How could they be so indifferent to something so strange? The logic he valued so much seemed to have dissipated, and what had once been a clear and understandable concept now seemed like a major flaw. However, Jameson was undeterred. He knew the answers were there, hidden beneath the surface, and he would begin his own investigation. Using what he called the deductive method, something he had learned in his solitary studies, he began to examine the village. To him, everything had an explanation, even if it was something outside conventional logic. He spent hours observing, taking notes, collecting clues. Meanwhile, his parents were beginning to notice that Jameson's behavior was changing. Martha, worried, tried to talk to her son. "Jameson, what's going on with you? Why are you so obsessed with these things? People are starting to talk about it." Jameson looked at her with a steady gaze. "Mom, something's wrong. The city isn't just silent, it's ignoring something. I need to find out what it is. I can't let this go." His parents were divided. William, his father, wanted Jameson to return to a normal life, away from these theories and the incessant search for answers that didn't exist. "Jameson, the world doesn't work the way you think. People are just trying to live their lives. That's what matters." But Jameson couldn't ignore the feeling that the answer was right in front of him, waiting to be discovered. He felt that the key to unlocking the mystery of the Masons and the strange events happening around the town lay somewhere in the village itself, in the little things everyone ignored. While investigating, he began to notice that some residents were acting strangely, as if they knew more than they were willing to tell. When Jameson approached to ask questions, they would change the subject or become visibly uncomfortable. This only increased his determination. Something was being covered up, and he wouldn't rest until he found out what it was. Jameson noticed a pattern in everyone's behavior. Whenever a strange event occurred, people seemed to avoid the issue, changing the subject or laughing nervously. It was as if everyone was dealing with something they couldn't understand, but also didn't want to confront, as if by ignoring it they could maintain normalcy. One day, while walking through the forest near the village, Jameson found something that would completely change the direction of his investigation, a cave hidden among the trees. Inside, he found traces of something much older and more disturbing than anything he had imagined. Walls covered in strange symbols, marks of a time that didn't fit the stories the villagers told. Something was buried there, something that could be related to the disappearances and the inexplicable events. Jameson knew he had come close to something big. The cave, with its symbols and riddles, seemed to be the starting point for a mystery far greater than he had imagined. He couldn't turn back. His destiny was intertwined with this discovery, and he was beginning to realize that his search for answers could forever change the lives of everyone in Mill Creek. Have you ever encountered a mystery that seemed to be hidden right in front of you, but was only revealed when you really delved deeper? As Jameson continued his investigation, tensions in Mill Creek rose. The search for answers was beginning to reveal more than he had imagined. However, there was more at stake than just the mystery of the Masons. Elements of the town's past began to emerge, connecting to seemingly unrelated events that somehow intertwined in a chilling way. Jameson, in his investigations in the cave, found a series of old and worn documents buried among the rocks. They were records of an ancient cult, a group that had existed long before Mill Creek was founded, and whose practices were mysterious and dangerous. The symbols on the cave walls, as he discovered, were linked to this cult, which had kept its activities secret for decades. But what was the cult looking for, and why had it seemingly disappeared without a trace? As Jameson began to piece things together, other townspeople, older and from a more distant generation, began to behave even more strangely. Several of them seemed to know more about the cult than they were willing to tell. Some, like Reverend Samuel, the local religious leader, showed visible unease whenever the cult's name was mentioned. Samuel, known for his righteousness, seemed to be hiding a dark secret, something that connected his personal history to the mystery Jameson was trying to unravel. During a community meeting at the church, Jameson tried to confront the Reverend. "Do you know the history of the cult that existed here before Mill Creek was founded?" he asked, with the sincerity and courage of someone certain of his discovery. Samuel, however, reacted coldly. "You're just letting yourself be carried away by superstitions, Jameson. The past is not something that should be reopened. There are reasons to forget certain things." Samuel's words brought more doubts to Jameson. The Reverend knew something, and his answer only reinforced the idea that the cult was somehow connected to what was happening in Mill Creek. But what was he trying to protect? And why did the townspeople seem so keen to keep this secret hidden? Jameson felt that the people's silence was more powerful than any answer. Furthermore, upon further investigation of the cave's documents, Jameson found a reference to something even more sinister, a lost artifact, an ancient stone with inscriptions that might have the power to open portals to another reality. The description of the stone was vague, but the implications were clear. The older inhabitants knew of this stone, but no one seemed to know where it was. The search for the stone could be the key to solving the mystery surrounding the disappearances and strange events. Meanwhile, tension in the city began to rise. The lack of answers was creating a sense of unease, and the residents were becoming increasingly suspicious of one another. Some began to suggest that Jameson was meddling in something he shouldn't, something that was no longer just a child's curiosity, but a real threat. And although he knew he was in danger, his determination to uncover the truth made him stronger. On the other hand, the other young people who had observed Jameson from afar began to get more actively involved. They, who had previously been shy and hesitant, now saw him as a figure of courage, someone willing to confront what no one else dared to touch. The group began to meet in secret, discussing what they knew and sharing any clues they could find. A growing force of rebellion was taking shape, a silent movement that could be both a help and a threat. One of the young women, Amelia, revealed a family secret to Jameson. She had discovered that her grandfather, before dying, had been one of the last living members of the cult. He had left behind a hidden diary, which Amelia found in an old trunk. The diary spoke of a projection of the mind and how the stone could open what he called a portal between worlds. Amelia gave the diary to Jameson, fearing that if it wasn't read, the city would be swallowed by a truth no one was prepared to face. Jameson, now aware that what was about to happen was far bigger than he had imagined, began to connect the dots. The cult, the stone, the people who knew more than they admitted, Amelia's diary, everything was falling into place. He could no longer hesitate. The fate of Mill Creek was in his hands, and the truth was closer than ever. But what would he do with this truth? Was he prepared to deal with the consequences of what he was about to discover? Have you ever been surprised by something that someone you distrusted was keeping secret? How did that change the way you saw things? The rain had begun to fall heavily that night, as if the sky over Mill Creek were preparing for a drastic change. Jameson was in the barn, studying the diary Amelia had given him. Each word seemed to intensify the weight of the discovery. The cult, the portal, the stone, everything connected in a way he hadn't imagined, but there was more, much more. He realized that the key to unlocking the mystery was linked to an old legend circulating among the oldest residents, a story that no one truly believed, but which had been passed down through generations. The legend spoke of a bearer of truth, a person destined to open the portals between worlds, a being who would have the ability to transcend the limitations of reality. The details were vague, but something in that story seemed to coincide with what he had been experiencing. Jameson felt a chill as he realized that he somehow fit the legend. He was the bearer of truth, the only person capable of uncovering the secret everyone was trying to hide. The weight of responsibility hit him like a blow. He wasn't just investigating a mystery. He was about to unleash something far deeper, something that could change the very fabric of reality. However, Something began to change in the town. The residents of Mill Creek, who until then had ignored Jameson's investigations, began to act even more strangely. Those who had previously ignored him now looked at him with a mixture of fear and distrust. They knew something was about to happen, something they couldn't control, but no one spoke openly about it. The silence that hung over the town was more oppressive than any words. That night, Jameson had a disturbing dream. He was in the cave, before the stone that he now knew had the power to open the portal between worlds. The stone was illuminated by an intense light, and upon touching it, a sensation of disintegration enveloped him, as if he were being torn apart between two realities. He saw scenes of people disappearing, a city crumbling into pieces, and a dark force taking over everything. When he awoke, the terror he felt in the dream still haunted him. The next day, Jameson went to Reverend Samuel, determined to confront him once and for all. He had a sense of urgency. Whatever was about to happen needed to be dealt with. "Reverend, I know you know more than you're letting on. The city is in danger, and I need your help to understand what's happening," Jameson said firmly. Samuel, visibly shaken, looked at the boy with a grim expression. "Jameson, you don't know what you're seeking. There are things the human mind shouldn't comprehend. There are forces at play that we can't control. The cult, the stone, all of that was buried for a reason." But Jameson didn't back down. "I know what it is. And I know I'm the only one capable of stopping all of this from happening. I can no longer ignore what is obvious." The Reverend looked at him with deep sadness. "You don't understand, boy. The stone, the cult, the truth you seek will not set you free. It will consume you." Before Jameson could answer, the Reverend stood abruptly and left through the door, leaving him alone with his heavy words. What did the Reverend know, and why did he seem so fearful of what Jameson was about to discover? There was a darker truth he wasn't willing to share. It was then that Jameson realized he could no longer trust anyone in the city. They were all trapped by a secret they didn't want to reveal. But he knew the truth was closer than ever. He had to go all the way, regardless of what it meant for him or for others. That same night, Jameson, armed with the journal and his unwavering determination, went to the cave again. He knew the answer was there. The stone was waiting for him. Upon arriving, the sound of rain hitting the stones created an almost magical atmosphere. Jameson felt the weight of history and the choices he was about to make. He couldn't turn back. He was the chosen one, the bearer of truth, and now he would face the destiny that the town of Mill Creek had tried to avoid for so long. With trembling hands, he touched the stone. Immediately, an intense light enveloped his body. The ground beneath his feet seemed to give way, and Jameson was dragged into an endless void. He felt as if he were being transported to another dimension, to a place where the laws of physics no longer applied. Shadows of ancient figures, whom he now recognized as members of the cult, began to materialize around him. They watched him with a mixture of fear and adoration, as if they had been waiting for this moment. The town of Mill Creek, the reality Jameson knew, was now disintegrating before his eyes. He was about to open a portal between worlds, and with that, the consequences could be far greater than he imagined. Have you ever had to make a difficult choice, even knowing that the consequences could change everything around you? What motivated you to keep going? The light from the stone consumed Jameson in a way he could never have imagined. Contact with the artifact was like an electric shock that coursed through his entire body, and the sensation of being pulled somewhere else was overwhelming. When the light dissipated, he found himself in an empty space, a dimension where time and space didn't seem to follow the same rules. What had been the ground beneath his feet was now an ethereal mist, and the silhouettes of figures he recognized as members of the cult surrounded him. They looked at him with a mixed expression of reverence and apprehension, as if they saw him not only as the bearer of truth, but as someone who was about to become something greater, something more powerful than any human being. They didn't speak. but their eyes seemed to communicate a message that Jameson felt but didn't fully understand. It was then that he heard a voice, but not from someone physically present. It was a deep voice reverberating in his mind that seemed to come from all directions at once. "You opened the portal, Jameson," the voice said. "Now the reality you knew is crumbling. The forces you awakened cannot be controlled by a mortal. You defied the laws that govern the world, and now the balance will be lost." Jameson felt the weight of those words. He knew he was dealing with something beyond human comprehension, something that surpassed everything he had imagined. And yet, he felt no regret. He was determined to uncover the truth, whatever the cost. But as the voice's words echoed in his mind, he began to realize there was no turning back. What he had done had not only altered the reality of Mill Creek, it had tampered with the very foundations of the universe. When he returned to his town, something was terribly wrong. Mill Creek, which had once seemed a simple and peaceful town, was now shrouded in a dense, dark fog. Life seemed to have been drained from the streets, and the people he knew seemed different. Their eyes were empty, and they didn't recognize Jameson, as if he were a stranger to them. The connection he felt with others had been broken in a profound and inexplicable way. He ran home hoping to find his parents, but upon arriving, he found the house empty. The living room was cold, lacking the familiar warmth he so loved. The walls, once full of life, seemed to crumble silently. William and Martha weren't there, and there was no sign that they had left. A feeling of despair began to overwhelm Jameson. He had gone too far. He had not only opened a portal to another dimension, but somehow he had pushed away the people he loved most. He searched the entire town, but Mill Creek seemed to have become a ghost town. The few residents who were still there didn't move, as if trapped in a deep trance. When he approached them, they didn't react, as if he no longer existed for them. The village he knew was no longer the same, and Jameson didn't know what to do. He was being consumed by his own curiosity and his desire to understand the truth. But now he was beginning to realize that the consequences of his actions were more serious than he could have imagined. As night fell, the city seemed to grow darker, as if the very earth had turned against him. Jameson felt an indescribable sense of loss, not just of his family, but of his own identity. He had crossed a threshold that now isolated him from everything he knew. It was then that he had a vision. The figures he had seen in the stone dimension began to materialize before him. They were silent, watching him. One of them, with a black cloak and deep eyes, approached. "You are lost, Jameson," said the figure in a voice that seemed to be a mixture of sadness and compassion. "What you sought was more than the human mind can bear. You not only altered reality, you broke the balance." Jameson felt his body tremble. He was seeing it clearly, but at the same time, he didn't know how to interpret it. He had opened the portal, but what had he achieved? He had defied everything, but at what cost? "You will have to make a choice," the figure said. "Either you return what was taken and restore the balance, or you will remain trapped in this limbo forever, with the city and its inhabitants at the mercy of the forces you have awakened." Jameson, with a crushing weight on his chest, knew the decision was in his hands. He couldn't simply undo what he had done, but could he try to restore what had been lost, try to reconnect what had been broken, or perhaps he would have to pay the price for having defied the laws of the universe. Have you ever done something in your life that, after it happened, made you question whether the pursuit of truth is worth the sacrifices we make? Jameson was at a breaking point. The town of Mill Creek, his family, even himself, everything was in pieces. The consequences of his actions had led him to an abyss from which he didn't know how to escape. Pain and doubt consumed him, and he found himself trapped between the desire to restore what he had lost and the pressure of knowing that perhaps there was nothing more he could do. But deep within him, a flame of determination still burned. He couldn't let fear and regret define his destiny. Mill Creek, his memories, and the people he loved needed him now more than ever. He had opened the portal, but he still had a chance to close the doors he himself had opened, and with them, bring back everything that seemed lost. Jameson felt the weight of responsibility more than ever. He was not only facing the consequences of his choices, but also the fact that somehow he might hold the key to restoring the balance that had been broken. He remembered the words of the figure in the portal dimension. Return what was taken and restore the balance. What did that mean exactly? How could he undo what he had done? The first step, he knew, was to understand what had happened to Mill Creek. The town was in a liminal state, like a shattered reality, and he knew that if he didn't act quickly, it could disappear forever. The dark fog that enveloped the village wasn't just a symptom of the chaos, it was a reflection of his own inner turmoil. Jameson went to the town's central point, where the old square was located. There, amidst the dense fog, he found something surprising. The monument that the townspeople had erected decades ago, a kind of symbol of unity and peace, was covered in a layer of dust and signs of wear. But what caught his attention most were the markings around the monument. They were symbols he recognized from the cult, the same ones he had seen in the cave. He knelt and touched the marks with trembling hands, feeling a wave of heat run through his body. As he touched the symbols, a sense of clarity washed over him. The pieces began to fall into place. The cult wasn't just a group that had vanished into the past. They were somehow connected to the town itself. The forces he had awakened were not only ancient, but also present, rooted in the very fabric of Mill Creek's reality. With renewed determination, Jameson stood. He knew what he needed to do. The portal he had opened was not a simple hole in space-time. It was a window between dimensions, a passage that connected not only worlds, but also the past and future of Mill Creek. And what he needed now was to give back what had been taken, not only the town, but also the part of himself he had lost by giving in to curiosity. But the path would not be easy. Jameson felt he needed to confront the essence of what he had done, the fears, the doubts, the ambitions that had led him to meddle in the unknown. He needed to take responsibility for his journey and understand what it truly meant to be the bearer of truth. What he was looking for was no longer just the answer to the mystery, but the very balance between what he desired and what he should do. That night, Jameson returned to the cave, the place where it all began. The stone walls were now bathed in a soft, almost ethereal light. He knew this was his last chance to undo the damage. What he sought now was not the stone itself, but an understanding of how he could use the portal's power to restore the city and the people he loved. With a deep sigh, Jameson approached the stone. The light enveloped him again, but this time he was prepared. He was no longer the impulsive and curious boy who had opened the portal without thinking about the consequences. Now he was someone who understood the weight of his choices. He was no longer searching for external answers, but for internal reconciliation. As he placed his hands on the stone, he felt a wave of energy course through his body, but this time it wasn't fear that overwhelmed him. It was a feeling of peace, of acceptance. Jameson knew that in doing this, he was not only correcting the city's mistakes, but also his own. He was redeeming himself, not for his actions, but for the path he chose to follow afterward. The town, in response, began to transform. The dark fog that enveloped Mill Creek began to dissipate, and the light of dawn shone through the trees. People began to return, one by one, emerging from their homes as if they had awakened from a collective nightmare. Their eyes, which had once been empty, now shone with a new awareness. Jameson couldn't foresee the future. He didn't know how his journey would end, but he now understood that sometimes the path to true understanding requires sacrifices and difficult choices. He had found the truth not only about Mill Creek, but about himself. And in doing so, he had restored the lost balance. Have you ever had to confront a past mistake and make the difficult decision to change? What did you learn from that experience? With Mill Creek slowly returning to normal, Jameson felt a slight sense of relief, but something still troubled him. The town seemed restored, but he knew there was still one last test to face. The forces he had awakened would not disappear so easily. He had done his best to correct his mistakes, but the reality that he had touched something beyond human comprehension did not leave him in peace. The restored balance was still fragile, and he knew that at some point the ultimate truth would need to be confronted. Jameson retreated to the countryside, to the place where it had all begun. The tall trees and distant mountains now seemed more imposing, as if the landscape itself reflected the weight of his choices. He gazed at the horizon, where the sun was beginning to set. The orange light illuminated the city in the distance, but for Jameson, this light was no longer comforting. It was a warning light, a light that called him to the final stage of his journey. In recent days, he had seen the city's inhabitants returning to their daily routines. They were at peace, or at least it seemed so, but Jameson knew that normalcy was fragile. Something inside him sensed that there was a layer of deceit in what was happening. The truth, the real truth, had not yet been revealed. He needed to confront it, whatever it might be. As he walked through the fields, pondering the complexity of his situation, he began to recall the words Reverend Samuel had spoken to him weeks before. The truth won't set you free. It will consume you. Jameson didn't know if those words were a warning or a prophecy, but he felt that the answer to what he should truly do lay somewhere between the lines of that message. He knew that if there was a way to return the city to its true essence, it wouldn't be without sacrifices. There was more to what he had awakened than just a portal. It was a new understanding of humanity itself, its limitations and its capabilities. Jameson couldn't save everyone. He couldn't restore the city's purity without losing something fundamental. It was inevitable. That night, he had an unexpected encounter. Amelia appeared at his door, her face pale, her eyes wide with worry. She seemed to have something important to say, something that might change the course of events. She was trembling, not only from the approaching storm, but from the feeling that something was about to happen. "Jameson, I found something," she said, her voice choked with anguish. "Something in my grandfather's diary. He wasn't just talking about the stone. He was talking about a sacrifice. It's not just the city that's at risk, but everyone who remained around it." Jameson looked at her, feeling a growing tension in his chest. "What do you mean by sacrifice?" "I don't know exactly, but it seems the cult always knew this. The stone isn't just a key to open portals. It's a junction point between worlds, a link between two realities. To restore peace, to maintain balance, something has to be given, something has to be lost." Amelia's words echoed in Jameson's mind, and he knew at that moment that the real test lay ahead. He could no longer control what would happen. He had broken something irreparable by opening the portal, and now he would have to pay the price. But what was he willing to sacrifice? While Jameson and Amelia discussed what to do, the approaching storm began to intensify. The winds howled, and lightning lit up the sky, as if nature itself were rebelling against human intervention. Jameson felt the pressure of the moment mounting, as if the fate of Mill Creek was about to be decided that night. Amelia, with the vision of her grandfather still fresh in her mind, suggested one last attempt. "Perhaps the sacrifice is the portal itself. If you close the portal, what was lost can be restored, but only if the stone is destroyed." The idea was dangerous, but Jameson felt it was the only viable option. Destroying the stone would not only mean the end of his journey, but the end of the possibility of the portal reopening. And perhaps, once the stone was destroyed, Mill Creek would return to what it always was, without the forces that had corrupted it. But to achieve that, he would have to confront the forces he himself had unleashed. He looked at Amelia, and they both knew there was no turning back. Jameson made a decision. He would go to the point in the cave where it all began, where he had opened the portal, and destroy the stone. He didn't know what would happen afterward, but he felt it was the only way to restore balance, or at least to try. Do you believe that sometimes, to correct a mistake, you have to give up something important? Have you ever made such a choice in your life? Jameson felt the weight of his choices as he walked along the dark trails toward the cave. The storm now raged with increasing intensity, as if the sky itself were challenging his decision. The strong wind whipped his face, and the surrounding trees swayed violently, but he couldn't stop. The portal he had opened was still somewhere, and the balance of Mill Creek depended on his action. Amelia was with him, but her words were more distant than ever. She knew, like Jameson, that the sacrifice was necessary. But what did destroying the stone truly mean? What would be lost, and what would be saved? These questions hung in the air, unanswered. They were about to face the unknown. Upon reaching the cave entrance, the scene unfolding before them was surreal. The light from the stone still shone intensely, like a beacon beckoning all who dared approach. The portal was open, a fissure between worlds, with a pulsating energy emanating from the stone like a beating heart. Jameson knew that by touching it again, he would not only destroy what had been done, but also risk being consumed by forces beyond his comprehension. "Are you ready?" Amelia asked, her voice trembling but full of determination. She knew what he needed to do, but at the same time, the uncertainty of the moment hung over them both. "Are you sure this is what we should do?" Jameson looked at her, his eyes reflecting the turmoil raging within him. "We have no choice. If we don't do this, Mill Creek will disappear forever. We can't live with the weight of what we've done." He stepped forward and placed his hand on the stone. The heat was unbearable, but he didn't recoil. The light emanating from the stone seemed to absorb everything around it, consuming the darkness of the cave with a terrifying intensity. Jameson felt a force pulling him, as if the stone itself were trying to overpower him, but he stood firm. He knew what he had to do. With a cry of determination, he ripped the stone from its pedestal. The light radiating from the stone's surface seemed to disintegrate the very space around him, as if reality itself were unraveling. A wave of energy surged through his body, and Jameson felt the weight of the universe on his shoulders. He was facing the greatest test of his life, and nothing else mattered but what he was about to do. With a swift movement, Jameson hurled the rock against the cave wall. The impact was brutal. The rock shattered into pieces, and the light it emitted exploded in a blinding eruption. A shockwave coursed through the ground, making the earth tremble beneath his feet. Jameson fell to the ground, his vision blurring and his breath catching from the force of the impact. For a moment, the world around him seemed to disintegrate, and Jameson feared that everything he had done would be in vain. But when he opened his eyes, the storm that had battered Mill Creek was beginning to subside. The fog that enveloped the town began to dissipate, and the sense of chaos that had hung over the city began to give way to peace. The trees around the cave, which had previously been swaying violently, were now calm, as if the world itself were recovering from a great struggle. The town of Mill Creek was saved. The portal had been closed, and with that, the town was back to how it was before. But at the same time, Jameson felt that something important had changed within him. He would never be the same again. He had confronted the forces of the universe, the very limits of human reason, and now he understood that, however much he had tried to restore balance, he would always live with the consequences of his choices. Amelia approached, her gaze filled with gratitude and relief. "You did it, Jameson. The city is saved." He looked at her but didn't answer immediately. His thoughts were elsewhere, in a distant reality where he now understood the true essence of the truth he had sought. He didn't know how to explain it, but he knew that somehow he had touched something deeper, something he couldn't turn back from. Truth was a powerful force, and now he knew it came at a price. "It's not just the city that's saved," Jameson finally replied, his voice deep. "I've changed too." With that, he stood and looked at the cave, where the last vestiges of the energy that once dominated the space began to disappear. Mill Creek was restored, but Jameson knew his journey was not yet over. He had been forced to confront his own limits, to understand the weight of his choices. And although the town was now at peace, he knew that true peace could only be achieved within himself. Have you ever had to make a decision that deep down you knew would change you forever? How did you deal with the consequences of that choice? The town of Mill Creek had returned to normal, but Jameson knew it would never be the same again. The sun rose for the first time in days, illuminating the streets that now seemed more alive than ever. However, the tranquility of Mill Creek was no longer a reflection of the peace he had restored. It was the quiet after a storm, a calm that hid the weight of what he had lost. Jameson stepped away from the cave, his body still tense, but his mind, though marked by pain, was beginning to find some clarity. He knew that, although Mill Creek was safe, he himself still bore the consequences of his choices. What he had done, opening the portal, unleashing the unknown forces, destroying the stone, all of it had changed not only the town, but the very essence of who he was. And there was no going back. Throughout his journey, Jameson had searched for answers that would free him from doubt and darkness. But now he understood that it wasn't the answers that truly mattered. It was the process of confronting them, dealing with the consequences, and ultimately accepting that the truth doesn't always bring relief. The truth often brings sacrifice. He had discovered this the hard way. As he walked through the city streets, he realized that people no longer saw him the same way. They were at peace, but the looks he received were now different. He knew that the weight of what he had done would not be erased with time. Some things simply cannot be forgotten, but perhaps with time they could be understood. Jameson didn't know what the future held. He felt that, despite having restored balance to Mill Creek, he himself would continue to live in a kind of inner limbo. The journey to true understanding wasn't over. Perhaps it never would be, but he also knew that however much the answers had consumed him, the choice to move forward, to continue despite the pain, was his. Mill Creek was saved, but true peace, Jameson learned, begins with acceptance. We cannot change the past, but we can decide how to live with it. What matters is not what we have already done, but what we choose to do with what remains. And although Jameson knew he had lost much, he still had a chance to live with the lessons he had learned. He was no longer the boy who searched for easy answers. He was someone who understood, in a bitter and enlightened way, the weight of truth. In the distance, the hills surrounding the city now seemed more serene, reflecting the quietude he felt in his heart. The gentle wind carried the scent of damp earth, as if the city was finally beginning to breathe again. And Jameson, now stronger, wiser, but also more lonely, continued his walk, knowing that the true challenge lay not in external forces, but in the internal choices he would have to make from that moment on. Sometimes we have to deal with the consequences of our choices, even if they change us forever. Have you ever had an experience where you learned to live with something irreversible? How did you deal with it? Years had passed since that night Jameson destroyed the stone. Mill Creek flourished, and the memory of what had occurred faded like a whisper in history, but for Jameson, peace was an enigma. He never found a definitive answer to what happened in that cave, but he learned to accept what he could not control. The town moved on, its streets more vibrant than ever, but he, in silence, continued his inner journey. The portal had been closed, but the doors within him remained open, always searching for a deeper understanding. How do you deal with what cannot be changed in your past? Have you found peace in accepting what you cannot control? And you, what would you do if you were in Jameson's place? Have you ever faced life-changing choices? Share your own experience in the comments or leave your opinion about the story. If this journey touched your heart, don't forget to like, share with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more stories that challenge us to reflect on our choices and the true nature of truth. Continue with us on this journey of self-discovery, where the only constant is change. We look forward to hearing your opinion. Until next time.